Today I wanted to share how I make sourdough bread. I'm by no means an expert, but I've spent a year or two developing this particular system. I actually did go visit with an expert, a guy that makes sourdough bread for a living. It was super informative, and he does a lot of things that I just can't or won't. One of which is his start. He feeds it like 3 times a day. He wants to make sure that it's in optimal growing conditions all the time. I just don't have that type of commitment. My start gets abused quite a bit. So I came up with this method, allows me a little to abuse my start a little bit. The one thing that I did come away with from him is how you measure. Rather than using volume, he uses weight. Weight allows you to be reproducible every single time. You don't have to sift your flour. You don't have to do any of that. Like a teaspoon of fine ground salt is going to be different weight than a teaspoon of coarse ground salt, on and on. But weight is going to be the same no matter what. Okay, so this recipe is actually based on my wife's grandmother's recipe. And she spent like a whole lifetime perfecting that recipe. I simply figured out how to substitute sourdough rather than yeast for that recipe. And so it's one of my favorites. So let's get started. First off, you can do this by hand in a big bowl. Just hope you have strong wrists and fingers. Using some type of food processor to mix it makes life a lot easier. So let's start with the start. So I'm actually going to need 400 grams of start. This start is actually a little bit past where it should be. You can see that it filled the whole jar at one time, and now it's only filling about 2/3 of the jar. That's because it bubbled up and then it used all its food, and now it's quit growing. I should have started this last night, but I had other things to do last night. And I usually like to start this in the morning, and you'll see why as this process goes on. However, this process makes up for that. There's still not any sour or alcohol smells coming off of it, so we're in good shape. All right, so measure out our 400 grams. All right. Now, the problem with sourdough is it sticks to everything. This is no exception. So what we're actually going to do is get the bulk of it in our food processor. And then the next ingredient is 900 grams of water. As you can see, it's pretty close to 4 cups. So what I'm actually going to do is take about half of that, and then it also calls for 1 egg. Put that egg in now. Then make sure that I blend up the egg and just mix as much of that start into the water as I can. Just that way I get as close to the 400 grams of start as possible. It's not actually my favorite food processor because it's got that thing sticking up in the middle. Makes it hard to pour stuff in, but that's what we have. Your water can be warm. That's up to you. This process, the way we do it, it will give your start a little head start, pun intended, but it doesn't have to be warm. You don't want it to be boiling hot, however. That's probably the big thing. Okay, so didn't get it all. There's still a little bit left, but close enough. Okay, so we'll just add the rest of the water. Next thing Next thing on the recipe is actually flour, but I add that last, and we'll go over that in a minute. 36 grams of salt. And I try and pour this all in one spot because too much salt can kill your start. So I pour it in one spot so it doesn't kill too much, and then until I can mix it all. So pour everything in exactly the same spot. When I'm not making this on camera, what I actually do is put it all in one bowl and pour it that way. But I want this to go a little faster. So sugar, 36 grams. And then potato flakes. Grandmother would use potato water. I don't have time for that, so potato flakes it is. 36 grams, or 17 grams of potato flakes. Then powdered milk. Nobody ever uses powdered milk. I have a hard time figuring out how to use ours, but it's great for this. 48 grams. Oil's supposed to be 17 grams. Oil sticks to everything. It's hard to measure weigh, so I just do a splash. It's probably more than 17 grams. It'll be okay. And then lastly, a cup of oats. This just to add a little extra fiber, as if our whole wheat bread doesn't have enough fiber. All right. So one thing that Grandma discovered pretty quickly in her whole wheat making trials, it's really hard to get people to eat 100% whole wheat bread, especially if you're not used to it. So what she came up with was about a third whole wheat, two-thirds white flour. Do grind our own wheat into flour. Make a video on that sometime. So the last thing we're going to add is 485 grams of whole wheat flour. You want, this is what we call a dough hook. That's what you want for this process. There's lots of different attachments, obviously, that go to food processors. Then you're going to want the lid. Right now, it won't be a big deal, but once we get all the flour in there, if you don't have the lid on, it'll make a huge mess. So one of the things I learned from the individual that makes sourdough is that when you're mixing up your first mixing of your ingredients, this particular thing I think you call a sponge at this stage, but you want to mix it very well, usually a couple minutes, because you want all those ingredients to combine very thoroughly. The rest of your mixings, you actually want to do them as little as possible. Those mixings, if you mix them too vigorously, then your bread won't rise as well. Something I didn't know. Okay, so now I've only have a third of the flour in here that it's going to end up with. This is on purpose. So now what I'm going to do is just let it sit for the whole day. Again, this is why I like to start in the morning. Kind of the rhythm I've developed just with my schedule and everything. So I'm going to let it sit till, like, it's almost 9. I'm going to let it sit till 6 or 7. While it's sitting at room temperature, it's doing exactly the same thing that it was doing in our jar of sourdough. It's growing and multiplying, making more yeast, more lactic acid bacteria. And so that just gives me a lot better raising. It's been about 12 hours since I added all the ingredients together. The only ingredient that I have left is the rest of the white flour. So we're going to do 985 grams. Now that it's all thoroughly mixed, we don't want to mix it too much more than that. Otherwise it'll negatively affect the properties. Now we're just going to let it sit overnight. I've let my dough sit overnight to raise. As you can see, it's raised fairly considerably. You want to apply a little flour to the counter. If you use weights, then the dough should be pretty close to the same every time. What we're going to want to do is just divide this into 4 equal pieces. As you can see, my bread pans are not equal, so I don't necessarily worry about that too much. So I now have my loaf divided into 4 equal pieces and start folding it over on itself. As we do that, it gets longer. Now, a lot of people have a lot of different ways of doing it. I do it fairly quickly. As you can see, now I have a little ridge here where I started rolling stuff over. Then I just bring it back on itself and press it down. And then that's the top of my loaf. I like to use parchment paper. You can use just a little bit of like non-stick spray and some flour if you wanted to. For me, parchment paper just makes everything so much easier. You never have to worry about your bread sticking at the end, because that is one thing that I hate when I'm making bread, is you get all the way done, you've done all that work, it looks beautiful, and you can't get it out of the pan. So the next step is just going to be to let those rise for about 3 to 5 hours. So now have the oven preheated to 425. Scoring the top is really pretty important. It gives all the steam, mostly, a place to escape. If you don't score the top, then you have a loaf that ends up like this. I did actually score the top, but not deep enough. And so then it cracks right along there, which isn't bad. Doesn't change the taste at all, but it does look better if the top is well scored. So to score the top, I just use you want a fairly sharp knife. I have this fillet knife that I know is really sharp. And so what you're going to want to do is just take, and from one end to the other, cut across, and then just to make sure I got it deep enough, I like to go back the other direction. When I put it in the oven, I like to be, the second or third from the bottom. Put it roughly the center. And my oven, and I suspect most ovens are about this size, I'm able to put all 4 loaves in on the same shelf without the bread pans touching each other. I don't know if that makes a difference, but I've always tried to do that. And now we'll just set it for 30 minutes. Don't forget to turn the oven off. Something I struggle with time to time. Didn't happen today, but if it ends up a little darker than you like, putting a little butter on it will certainly help its appearance and its taste a little bit. It's hard to go wrong with butter. Time we've all been waiting for. That's good. That's really good. While I finish off this piece of bread, let's go to the next skill.